Henry VIII, King of England from 1509 until his death in 1547, is one of history's most well-known monarchs. Perhaps you know him as the man who married 6 times and had 2 of his wives executed. Or maybe you recognize him as the man who broke England off from the Roman Catholic Church. Whatever your opinion of Henry, it is hard to deny that his story is an interesting one, especially given how much his personality changed over the course of his life. Henry came to the throne at the age of 17 and was considered by many to be the perfect Renaissance prince. He was a talented musician, an excellent swimmer and athlete, and an intelligent, witty and charming ruler. In fact, when he rode through London soon after he took the throne, the citizens were so enamored with their new king that they tore down the houses along the route, just to get a glimpse of him. Such was the adoration people had for their young king. It seemed that nothing could stand in the way of the boy king. He had everything a monarch could want, a loving if somewhat strict father in his predecessor, Henry VII, a powerful noble family behind him, and the adoration of his subjects. But this adoration wouldn't last long, nor would Henry's seemingly bright future. All because of one thing: a son. As we mentioned earlier, Henry's father, Henry VII, was a Tudor, a relatively new noble family who had risen to prominence during the Wars of the Roses. These wars were a brutal series of civil conflicts fought between 2 noble families, the Yorks and the Lancasters, for control of the English throne. Henry VII's victory in the war was largely due to the support of one faction of the Lancasters, and he owed much of his power to them. His son, however, saw this differently. He viewed the Lancasters as a threat to his power and wanted to eliminate them from positions of prominence. And what better way to do that than with marriage? In 1509, when Henry was only 17, he married Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Spanish nobility and the former queen of his sister, Mary. Catherine was the perfect candidate for his new plan. Not only was she a member of a powerful European royal family, but she was also a Lancaster. By marrying her, Henry could solidify his claim to the throne and remove his rivals from positions of power. At least that was the plan. But there was one major obstacle in his way: Catherine's uncle, Pope Julius II. Julius wasn't exactly fond of the marriage. You see, Catherine had previously been married to Henry's older brother, Arthur, who died before he took the throne. And the Pope felt that marrying someone who had previously been married to a king was unnatural and against God's will. Despite the Pope's reservations, however, Henry and Catherine went ahead with the marriage anyway. For a while, things seemed to be going well. They had a son named Henry, who became the Prince of Wales, and a daughter named Mary. But Henry still didn't have the son he wanted. He began to resent Catherine for this and started to look for other women to marry. Soon, he met Boleyn, a young woman with whom he became infatuated. Obsessed with the idea of having a son, Henry decided that he needed to marry Anne. And to do that, he would need to annul his marriage to Catherine, which is where the Pope comes in again. You see, if Henry wanted to marry Anne, he needed the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine, something the Pope was reluctant to do. Ultimately, though, he relented and agreed to the annulment. There was one problem, though. He agreed to annul the marriage on the condition that Catherine would never marry again, even if she became a nun. Since the Pope considered Catherine to be the true queen, he did not feel that she should live out the remainder of her days under the shadow of another marriage. Henry, however, didn't care. All he wanted was his divorce. And so England broke away from the Roman Catholic Church, and the Church of England was born with Henry at its head. Now, don't misunderstand us. This wasn't the first time a church had broken away from Rome. It happened quite often, actually. However, it was the first time an established church had done so. And now that Henry was the supreme leader of the church in England, he had the power to grant himself an annulment. Finally, Henry and Anne were able to marry for a while. It seemed as though the break from Rome hadn't been such a big deal. Henry's subjects mostly ignored it, seeing it as little more than a spat between two stubborn men. But Henry didn't see it as a small deal. And as time went on, he grew more and more paranoid, convinced that the Pope and the rest of Europe were looking to take back control of the church in England. To prevent this, he began to persecute those he saw as enemies of the church. First, he executed 3 of his counselors, then his close friend, Thomas More. It didn't matter that these men were innocent or that More was a saint. If Henry thought you were a threat to his church, you were a threat to his power and therefore had to die. He even went as far as to break away from the Holy Roman Empire, the spiritual head of which was the Pope. Henry declared himself the supreme head of the church and began to seize church property. And all the while, he was still searching for that elusive male heir, wanting to make sure that his future son would become the head of the church as well. Henry married 6 times throughout his life, 2 of whom he had executed. We'll tell you about those marriages in just a moment. First, let's go back to 1533 when Henry and had a daughter, and he was still without a son, and had made it clear that she would never accept a position as co-head of the church, and thus Henry decided she had to go. Secretly, he had been seeing one of his female attendants, Catherine Howard, for some time and was ready to move on. He had been arrested and charged with treason and adultery, both of which she likely didn't commit, and had her executed in May of 1536. Just months later, Henry married Catherine in secret and shortly after openly. But Catherine, like Anne, eventually fell out of favor with the king. Accused of adultery, Catherine was executed in February of 1542. And once again, Henry found himself alone. By this point, he was obese, having reached a weight of nearly 400 pounds. He suffered from crippling arthritis, ulcers, and high blood pressure. He was constantly in pain and required the assistance of servants just to walk. He was also completely alone, having alienated almost everyone around him. Even his daughter, Mary, whom he had previously named heir to the throne, was sent away from court for criticizing his decision to break from the Catholic Church. His son, the future Edward VI, was also estranged from him, as he preferred to live a lavish lifestyle in France rather than return home to take on royal duties. In fact, the only people he trusted were the members of his Privy Council, a group of advisors who helped run the country in his place. But even they were never safe around Henry. In 1540, he had one of his ministers, Thomas Cromwell, executed after accusing him of plotting against him, despite the fact that Cromwell had once been one of the king's closest allies. Now, this brings us to one of the most pivotal moments in Henry's life. A jousting accident in January of 1536. He had been participating in a tournament when he collided with another knight. The force of the collision was great enough to send a lance straight through Henry's leg, leaving a wound that would never fully heal. It was clear that Henry needed medical attention, but Queen Catherine was furious that anyone would dare treat her husband without her permission. She ordered the wound to be covered up and ignored until it turned into a disgusting, foul-smelling ulcer. Everyone around Henry knew that the wound looked horrible, but no one dared tell him. They were too afraid of the Queen's wrath. Finally, after several weeks, Henry realized the truth and demanded that his doctors treat the wound. Unfortunately, it was too late. The damage had already been done, and according to some historians, Henry may have suffered a brain injury during the fall. This could explain his erratic behavior as the wound healed over the next few years, including the executions of his closest allies and advisors. In fact, it is believed by some that this injury ultimately led to his death in 1547. Henry's health continued to deteriorate, and his doctors gave him a concoction of questionable remedies to try to help him. One of these included letting blood by making incisions in his leg, a common practice at the time. But since the wounds were already infected, this only made things worse. Eventually, the infection spread, and Henry died on January 28, 1547. He was succeeded by his son, Edward VI. Now check out what really killed Henry VIII, or watch Boleyn and the 6 wives of Henry VIII instead.